Okay, looks like the recorded is starting. Welcome everyone to the Ordinary High Navigability Training. If we can start, Nicole, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yep, I'm Nicole Hayes. I am the Water Management Specialist. I cover Iron, Oneida, Vilas, Price County. So I handle, waterways, wetlands, permitting, enforcement, things like that.
Excellent. I'm Sue Vanden Langenberg, the Shoreline Program Coordinator for the state. Of the counties in the North Central district that we have here today, I cover Portage, Marathon, Lincoln, Oneida, and Vilas. Kathy Kramus covers Wood County, and then Kristen Rankin covers Langlade, Forest, and Florence, just so you know. So thank you for coming to the training today. We wanted to provide an educational opportunity for both shoreline zoning and land con staff, just to help gain confidence when going out in the field. What we're going to cover today is jurisdiction and authority over those items, as well as what to look for when you're out in the field, making those ordinary high watermark and navigability determinations. And of course, next week, we're going to follow up and actually take what we learned today and go out and use our skills out in the field. And with that, we are going to turn our video off, and I'm going to turn it over to Nicole to start the training.
All righty, so Wisconsin's water regulations. I'm sure you guys are familiar with, the public trust doctrine, the WOTUS rule, so I'll kind of skip over all that stuff. Particularly what we're going to be focused on is identifying ordinary high and navigability as it pertains to Chapter 30, 31, and the shoreline zoning regulations. So the DNR regulates everything below the ordinary high water mark. So that's where we look at permits for dredging piers, shoreline riprap. Something else to keep in mind is we have jurisdiction over all water courses under Chapter 31. So that's where we have the saying, all navigable waterways are water courses, but not all water courses are navigable. So if there's a project where someone wants to impound water, it could be a rock weir, an embankment, if they're trying to create a pond over something that may or may not be navigable, that's where Chapter 31 may come into play. So keep that in mind as you come across projects, or if people have inquiries about things, you still may want to get us involved with that. And as far as the shoreline zoning regulations, that's where NR 115, 116, 117, and 118 may come into play. Shoreline zoning setbacks, things like that. So with those regulations, who can make those jurisdictional determinations? I'll let Sue take over on that.
As Nicole said, the department regulates below the ordinary high water mark, and their authority comes from the public trust doctrine as well as state statute. And they regulate things such as piers, riprap, dredging, etc. Local governments, as you know, also have jurisdiction, but it's primarily above the ordinary high water mark. And therefore, counties have jurisdiction in determining ordinary high water marks and navigability for those shoreline zoning purposes, and in order to enforce that zoning ordinance, i.e. the water setback is the main topic. One thing to note as it relates to shoreline zoning is that there were statute changes, one of which provided that after April 28th of 2016, surveyors could mark and put the ordinary high water mark on their surveys. One thing to note is that If the department has not determined that ordinary high water mark, that is in fact the case, that they can make that determination for shoreline zoning purposes. And for that reason, we suggest that counties work with their surveyors. I'm sure you all have a handful of surveyors that do work in your counties. So developing a good relationship with those surveyors is a great thing. That way you guys can work together and make sure that you're on the same page as it relates to where that ordinary high water mark is, so that those surveys can represent the ordinary high accurately for now and for future building purposes.
And I'd like to throw in there that we will do the same on our end. We'll work closely with surveyors if they have projects that relate to Chapter 30 regulations, and we are in the works with putting on future trainings with surveyor associations and organizations to help educate them on what that process looks like for determining an ordinary high water mark. So we'll be working on assisting them as well. Something else that is somewhat new is the NR 317 process. This is called the third-party confirmation and determination service, where someone could submit a request with a fee. This process is specific to like third-party, not non-government entities, to request us to either do a confirmation or a determination for a specific project. It does have to be related to Chapter 30 purposes. So if someone were to submit something that was related to a setback, we would dismiss that and encourage them to work with the local county zoning department for that. So that's where if you guys wanted to get assistance from us, what that is called is a technical assistance request. So if you're asking for, if you're at a difficult site, or are a newer staff member and aren't sure about where to make the call, what you could do is submit to us the desktop data, site photos, any field data you've collected. You can email that to us, and then we can work through helping you guys make that call. And we can enter that decision into our database so that it reflects in our surface water data viewer, our documentation, and then we can follow up with an email to you guys of that determination or concurrence that we worked through with you guys. So when you're looking at a project and you're wondering if the department already made a determination at that location, you could look that up via our surface water data viewer map. We have layers that show permits and determinations. It could be anything from a brown dot, yellow, green, blue. All of those could be a previous department navigability or ordinary high watermark determination. Now, there is some historical data that may not be shown on the map. So if you aren't sure or suspect that maybe there was some history to the area that you're looking at, you could request us to find that information for you as well. Another thing that I would like to throw out there is that we have a new interactive map layer that's very similar to Surface Water Data Viewer, and that's called SW4P. I think we're starting to call it SWAP, but it's Stormwater, Waterway, and Wetland Permit Viewer. But it has additional layers and features like LiDAR data with more of an interactive hillshade layer that's like in a color scheme. So that's really been a new tool that's been awesome to have. So I would recommend looking at that. Other online resources that the department has for you are some items listed here. So if you'd like to go over that.
Sure. So when you're preparing to go out in the field to do an ordinary high water mark or navigability determination, it's always best to be prepared before you go out in the field. One of the things we have on this page that I want to point out is the department has recorded a video. It's about an hour and 50 minutes, so make sure you give yourself some time to look at it. But it goes through an in-depth training. And so if you have any new staff, this would be great on a rainy day. Take a look at this video to help yourselves get some additional information. Also on this page, you'll see fact sheets for both navigability as well as ordinary high water marks. These are helpful just to get yourself familiarized or to carry with you. If a property owner has questions, you can always provide that fact sheet. The other thing we have, if you look on the bottom portion of this page, there is third-party guidance for both of those determinations. Those are also helpful tools, as well as the data collection forms. You know, when you're doing on-site determinations, it's always imperative to have notes, have pictures detailing how you made that determination. You want to be able to defend that determination if ever questioned. And so having these data collection forms are useful. Now, whether you use these forms or have your own form, it doesn't matter. It's just helpful. So having those with you in the field so you don't miss any important information. These forms are helpful along with your pictures and notes, like Nicole had said, to send to the WMS if you find yourself with a super challenging site. These are the things that we would want to look at as well as your determination so that we can have a conversation and make that concurrence. Next slide, we also have additional resources available, talking about preparing to do work out in the field. It's always good to do a desktop review before you go out and make that determination, familiarizing yourself with that site and the sites around you. So here are just a few of the resources that you can use when doing that desktop review. It's useful for both ordinary high as well as navigability. And this can be provided to the WMS when you provide those data forms if you're asking for technical assistance. If you're not familiar with doing a desktop review, the Shoreland staff is putting together a video that we will make available, basically an how-to, so you can reference that to help you navigate through these different websites and how to use them. So that'll be coming in the future. Okay, ready for the next one. These are just snapshots of the data collection sheets that you can use when you're doing your ordinary high navigability determinations. We referenced this on the slide prior, but just to give you some sense of what they look like. Easy enough to print out a batch of these and keep them on your desk. So when you're ready to go out in the field, you have them with you. That's all I have for that, Nicole.
Okay. So let's start with making navigability determinations. So we have case law that supports, what is something that's navigable. So a waterway is navigable if it has a defined bed and bank with enough water to float a personal watercraft on a reoccurring basis. The water doesn't need to be present at the time of the determination for it to be deemed navigable. As long as the channel has those dimensional requirements to float a watercraft, then it would be considered navigable. So when you're out in the field, some of the data points that you're going to want to be collecting is going to be if you see banks, bed and banks, and they're clearly defined, and you can identify an ordinary high water mark with that, you're going to want to make sure you get all the dimensions that would represent the ability to float a small watercraft. So you can measure the banks, you can measure the ordinary high water mark, what the depth is for the bank and for the ordinary high. So taking those vertical measurements and then making the measurements horizontally from ordinary high to ordinary high and from bank to bank. You'll also want to gather pictures. You want to make sure that when you take the pictures, they're zoomed in and more of like a zoomed out view as well, looking upstream, downstream, left and right of you, and placing any size reference materials in the picture. So whether it's a shovel, a person, a flag, or an arrow, so that you can clearly identify what it is you're trying to point out in the photo is really helpful. So in some of the examples, you'll see some of those items in the pictures that I provide for those examples. You'll also want to document, are you in a season that's particularly wet? Is it a particularly dry year? You'll want to make note of that so that years down the road, if you have to look back at this or if someone else looks at your determination, they'll be able to better understand what conditions were at play when you made that determination. So keep in mind these 3 points when you are on site. You're looking for a defined bed and bank. You're looking for evidence of an ordinary high water mark within those banks. And does that channel have capacity to float a small watercraft? So in general, a kayak or a canoe is going to have anywhere from 27 to 32 inches in width to draft that canoe, and anywhere from 3 to 6 inches of water depth necessary for that watercraft to float. So let's get into the what ifs. What if there's a bunch of rocks or trees or aquatic vegetation, cattails, all those things in the channel that would make it not physically navigable? We have case law that supports that even if it can't be navigable in fact, if it still has the capacity to hold the water to be able to float a canoe, if you could envision all that aquatic vegetation being gone within that channel, it would still be determined as navigable. Man-made obstructions and other things can be portaged around. And so long as there is enough water to float on a reoccurring basis, especially in the spring, then it would be still determined as navigable. Another question we get is, what if it's a stream that is maybe 30 years ago, the town made an enclosure through a culvert system, or it was realigned or severely impacted by farming? We have case law that states the legislature has no more authority to emancipate itself from the obligation resting upon it to preserve for benefit of all the people forever for the enjoyment of the navigable waters within its boundaries. Sounds really confusing, but essentially what that case law states is that navigable waters are held in trust by the state to ensure the public resource is protected. So we have the ability to regulate those waters essentially indefinitely for the protection of those waters and to ensure that the public interest, the public can benefit by still using those waters. Another common question is, a navigable channel versus a drainage ditch. So if you start doing the desktop review and find that there is Stream history, you have evidence of a defined bed and bank, and maybe it's being manipulated by farming practices. If there is that history associated with that navigable stream, it would be determined as navigable. Now, if there is a ditch that's created that doesn't have that stream history, then it would be considered a farm drainage ditch. So if you have a project where someone is looking to dredge or do a grassed waterway, and you're not able to determine if there is stream history or not, that's still a project that may be regulated under Chapter 30. So that's where you could get us involved, and we can work through some of those projects or any concerns that you guys may have about those types of determinations.
These are challenging situations. And so, as Nicole said, that technical assistance, reaching out with what information you have and reaching out to the WMS, it's a great way to make sure we're all on the same page.
So the first example for navigability that I wanted to walk you guys through is, here's a farm example. And when I started looking through the desktop data for this intermittent stream, you kind of notice that the intermittent stream stops, and it didn't continue towards the east side of the highway. It didn't continue farther south. The old USGS maps kind of show it stopping, and then there's some indicators that there may be wetlands present. The aerial images show that it's fairly flat, that maybe it's, surface water, wetland runoff into the intermittent stream. The area in question was a ditch that flowed to the highway. And so what that looks like in the field. So standing on the highway, looking west through this ditch, you can see there is some water impounding. There might be a ditch, a channel, something that was created. So the idea was to determine if that segment was navigable. So you want to consider what's happening upstream, downstream, looking at the desktop data. Was there stream history? Does it look like there was any established bed and banks that you could see clearly from the aerial imagery? Looking at kind of in the center, if you could see my mouse here, that's where the channels, bed and banks really started. And looking at the old aerial imagery, there was nothing that indicated that this was historically a channel. It was one of those artificial ditches that were created that connect to a navigable channel. So what I suspect was happening here is that you have the headwaters of an intermittent stream, where at some point it has the characteristics of a defined bed and bank with an ordinary high water mark that has the capacity to float a canoe. So that's what we identified on site, is where this wooded area is where those conditions started to form. Another example I have is a lake outlet scenario. So on the left is the aerial image from Surface Water Data Viewer. On the right, you have the LiDAR data from the SWAP viewer. So what's really nice about this LiDAR is it takes that hillshade and puts it into a color scheme. Now, when you zoom in and out of the mapping feature, these colors are going to change, because what they're looking at is within the extent of your window, what the highest elevation is and what the lowest elevation is, and it puts that in a color gradient. So the white and red is going to be the highest elevations within those parameters, and the greens and blues are going to be the lowest elevations. So you can see to the top right is the lake. What I assessed was, is this low area navigable or not? And you can see that there is a stream and a channel farther to the west. And when I looked through the desktop data, there was no mapped intermittent stream. There was nothing identifying wetlands at this parcel that I reviewed. But looking through the LiDAR, it kind of suggested otherwise, that there may be something, a channel here, maybe wetlands to take a look at. When I looked at the old topo maps, I saw that there was an intermittent stream identified. Looking at the 1993 historic aerial image, you could see that there are wet signatures throughout that channel. And then through the 1986 and 1955 aerial image, you can see a defined channel and inundation of water. For the site visit, the picture on the left is starting at the lake. So the lake is behind me. And you can see that there is the ordinary high. I identified that the lake was about 10 inches low from the ordinary high watermark. And you can see the influence of ice shove and that changing of shoreline composition in this channelized area. The picture on the right is the channel behind me, and the lake is in the front. The channel itself measured to be 89 inches wide and 13 inches deep. So that's where, if you were to envision the lake level being at the ordinary high water mark, there would be water flowing through here at that elevation. The picture on the right, you could see the banks. You can see there is those characteristics that you would look for in identifying the ordinary high water mark. So you have a lack of vegetation along the bank bottom, deconsolidation of materials. You have the water staining, the decaying debris within the bed, and then you have longer standing terrestrial woody vegetation on top of the banks. Now, when you look at the channel, it looks a little different. So the picture on the left, the lake is behind me and I'm looking towards the channel. The arrow is pointing to a culvert. And what you notice is a lot of vegetation within this low area. So my initial reaction was, oh, is there a channel in here, or is this just a wetland complex? These can be difficult sites to look at, but don't let that vegetation that's growing within that area scare you. So what I'm seeing in this left picture is there's a lack of terrestrial woody vegetation growing, and where it is higher on the bank, you see that long-standing woody vegetation growing, which tells me that this area inundates enough with water that it doesn't allow that terrestrial vegetation to grow. The picture on the right is me standing at the culvert looking at the lake. And what you can see in this picture is those indicators for the ordinary high water mark. You could see there is there's mosses growing on the right. You could see that tree line. You could see where there is that detritus, that water staining on those leaves. So there is an ordinary high water mark at this location. So some of those plants that can throw you off sometimes, you can have, if you have an intermittent stream like this that does dry up occasionally, you can see a variety of plants. So smartweed, lake sedge, calopalustris, jewelweed. You can see a lot of that more like invasive weeds that come in. They can come in and grow after about a week of that water drawing down. So that's where some of those species aren't really indicators. You want to look for that long-standing woody tree line that's been, present for 20, 30, 40 years. You want to look for those older trees to help guide you where that ordinary high water mark may be. So I was able to determine the ordinary high water mark to be located where these two blue arrows are shown, which does line up with what you're seeing in the LiDAR data. The 2-foot contours are shown on this LiDAR map, and that kind of gives you a good idea that if this were to be mapped out or surveyed, you could follow that elevation throughout this entire channel to give you an idea of where that ordinary high water mark is located. This was determined to be navigable. So when you're looking at making a navigability determination, you're looking for the ordinary high water mark. So I really wanted to focus a lot of the time on this presentation to go through how to identify an ordinary high water mark. So when you're making those determinations, keep in mind that anything that is navigable is held in trust by the state. And that starts where, if there's open water, that navigable waterway stops at the ordinary high water mark. So that is really the important thing to keep in mind, is where that jurisdiction starts and stops. That ordinary high water mark is really important. Now, the definition of the ordinary high water mark is the point on the bank up to which the presence and action of the water is so continuous as to leave a distinct mark either by erosion, destruction of terrestrial vegetation, or other easily recognized characteristics. So that's going to be those two primary indicators that you're looking for in the field, which is going to be those physical indicators and biological indicators. Now remember that an ordinary high water mark is not a set elevation. Let's say for a lake system, the ordinary high water mark has to be reviewed at each location that your project is at. The ordinary high may not be the same on the entire lake due to the erosion, the terrestrial vegetation, the wind and wave action that's present. So that ordinary high may change if you're on the west side of the lake, the east side of the lake. If you're on a stream or river segment, that's going to have flow, so that elevation is going to change, going up and down gradient of that stream system. So diving into those indicators a little bit more, we can touch on those physical characteristics. Those are going to be ice scars, ice shoves, ice berms. You're going to have wave erosion. You could have scouring of banks, undercutting in these areas that don't have much of a gradient. You could see mud staining, water stains, debris lines if there is aquatic vegetation that's accumulating on the shoreline. You can see sediment sorting. So that's where you get those beach scenarios or gravel bars. So all of those are indicators of the physical characteristics. So in the image, you can see that erosion line on the rocks. You can see there's a lack of terrestrial vegetation. And in looking at biological characteristics, you're going to be looking for the transition of woody or terrestrial vegetation to more aquatic vegetation or wetland vegetation. You'll see that mosses or lichen may occur at or near the water's edge, so that's something to look out for. The growing of horizontal tree roots is a good indicator that you're near the ordinary high water mark. Now, wetland vegetation like cattails, sphagnum bogs, things like that are all going to be indicators of vegetation that grows below the ordinary high water mark. Other factors that you want to consider outside of physical and biological characteristics are recent human disturbance can kind of make the ordinary high water mark just not easily identified. So that's where you're going to want to look at just adjacent to that human disturbance, looking at neighboring properties. You'll also want to factor the shoreline configuration. So, are you in a small inland bay, or are you at a headland point, a peninsula that has a steeper bank? Those steeper banks or headland points where it's getting a lot of wind and wave action may change where that ordinary high water mark is located. Shoreland wetlands, so just vegetated lake beds, can make those ordinary high determinations challenging as well. Another consideration is if you have a high water year where there is flooding, you could have seepage lakes that have water higher than what the ordinary high water mark is, so you may not be able to make an ordinary high determination if you have those flooded conditions, or if you have unusually low water years. Let's say the seepage lake, the lake's 3, 5, 7 feet low. You'll want to keep that in mind when you're doing sites for those types of locations. And I do have examples kind of highlighting some of these other factors as well, so I can share a little bit more with those examples. Now, when you go on site to make an ordinary high determination, keep in mind that the states hold title to the beds of lakes. Now that's going to be natural lake systems. Impoundments that are controlled by dams may be a little bit different. The owner of the dam might be a FERC dam. It might be a dam that's owned by a county, in which that bed ownership may be a little bit different. The general rule is to always keep your feet wet. Now, in a stream system, the riparian owner holds title to the bed of the navigable stream. So just be cognizant of that when you do an on-site as well, that you may want to keep your feet wet while you're doing some of these if it is, possibly a contentious site visit that you're doing. Sue, did you want to make a comment on this slide?
Sure, this is a good point to talk about. When you're going out doing inspections for shoreline zoning, it would be good if you haven't had a conversation, talk with your corporation counsel. Obviously, you are out in the field representing the county and making determinations and collecting data, and talk with them about what the county's policy is with regard to going on private property. I know when I worked at the county, we would knock on a door and let people know who we were, why we were there, and verify that we had permission to go on site. So just something to think about, and have that conversation with your corp counsel to make sure they have your back as well.
And there are some unique sites that I wanted to add. you might want to keep an eye out for stream systems that do have beaver ponds. So we do have case law that supports if there is continuous beaver activity along a stream corridor where the beaver's activity is so like consistent throughout the history of the stream that ponds can be considered, or like the impoundment created by the beaver dam could also create a navigable impoundment where the ordinary high is outside of that original stream channel. I have been to 2 sites like that where the beaver dam's impoundment was considered like a navigable pond. So if you do get into any of those situations, I'd be, more than happy to do those on sites, help you assess that, because those are pretty tricky situations. Up in the Northwoods, we also have a lot more vegetated lake beds, which can be difficult to discern where the ordinary high water mark is. I do have some examples that can touch on what those look like as well. So going into identifying those physical and biological characteristics, here's some examples where I have a flag and an arrow identifying those features that I'm trying to point out. So here you have those biological conditions where you have terrestrial vegetation, trees up on top of the bank, and within the channel itself, you can see those that sediment sorting. You can see some of those exposed roots, inundation of water, the water staining, and kind of that lack of vegetation within the channel itself. The image on the right here shows abutments on a bridge. Those have some physical indicators of the water staining. And then you have behind the abutments the channel that has a lack of terrestrial vegetation. So you kind of want to make sure you're gathering as many indicators that you can find at each of your sample points. And especially for stream systems or rivers, you're going to want to do multiple sample points along that corridor and gather within each one of those sample points as many physical and biological characteristics that you can find to support your determination.
One thing, if I could just jump in, Nicole has a wonderful picture on the left-hand side with the pin flag and the arrow. And if you don't have these items, they are super helpful, and perhaps have your office order some of these things for you. Not only do they help you remember what things look like and be able to visualize things when you get back in the office, it also helps to communicate with others. For example, when you're doing shoreline zoning work, you may not be able to coordinate a time with the owner or the surveyor to go on site, but if you can get out there prior, mark the ordinary high water mark with a pin flag, you can then be able to communicate with that owner so they can visualize where that 75-foot setback is from. Or if a surveyor is following you, can't get out till the next day, they can then see where your flags are located to make sure that they locate that on the survey. So super helpful tools.
So here's another example. These are fairly easy examples. You can identify the tree line, horizontal root growth. You could see the undercut bank. And one thing to note is when you have horizontal root systems, the erosion underneath these, that the weight of the trees can lower the tree lower than what the ordinary high water mark is. So the ordinary high water mark on the image to the right is likely where that moss is starting to die and decay. So that ordinary high water mark would be at the top of that undercut. Same for the picture on the left here. Here's some examples of exposed lake bed. So, and an example where there is a lot of aquatic vegetation along the bank edge. So on the picture on the left, you can see the two orange flags identifying that bed and bank where the ordinary high water mark is located. Now the image on the right is actually like an enforcement case where someone put gravel on the bed of the lake, and this orange or this red arrow indicates where the ordinary high water mark was identified, and that entire exposed lake bed is where that illegal fill was placed. The image on the right is looking towards the water, the open water. So that's where you have a lot of that terrestrial, not terrestrial vegetation, excuse me, sphagnum moss. You have that bog type of scenario of that vegetation growing on the bed of the lake. Here's an example where you can see the biological and physical indicators right along this blue line. You have the water staining on the rock, and then the sediment sorting the exposed beach, and then the woody terrestrial vegetation above it. Here's an example of a vegetated lake bed, predominantly located in the eastern portion of the lake. When you look at the LiDAR data that we have available, that vegetated lake bed area can show up as like this little kind of pockmarked area, and that's a pretty good indicator that it's going to be a fun site visit and you need to bring hip waders. When you are looking at vegetated lake bed scenarios, you're going to want to look at some reference sites. So what I mean by that is you could see at the northeast corner here, hopefully you guys can see my mouse, there's an area that has a steeper bank. And what you can do is identify the ordinary high water mark where it's more easily identifiable for those physical indicators, like the undercut bank, the water staining on rocks, horizontal tree roots. So once you get an idea of what a reference point site looks like, for example, when I did this on site, I noticed that the water was like 2 or 4 inches lower than what the ordinary high water mark was at that reference site. So then as I looked at other sample points within this vegetated lake bed area, I kept that in mind that where the water level was lower than what the ordinary high water mark was for that reference point. So as I was gathering the field data in that vegetated lake bed area, the picture shows me standing where this orange star is located. And the picture is looking east, so kind of parallel to where that bank is and where the vegetated lake bed is. So on the right of the picture would be where the lake is, and on the left would be that bank. So here you can find flags. So I placed a flag on the lower part of the picture. There is another one, you can barely see it, just below where this person is standing. And that is where we found a change in the biological indicators. So to the right, you had sphagnum moss, you had lichen growing, it was really spongy. When you walked through that, water was, kind of overtopping your boots, which tells me that there's no mineral soil and that is a vegetated mat growing on top. To the left was where you could find that mineral soil, that bank edge where you had that woody, long-standing vegetation and trees growing. You want to look for that long-standing tree line where the trees are much older. And typically on a floating bog mat, you're going to see younger tree species that are likely dead already, which gives you a good understanding that throughout time, that area has inundated that root system and killed those trees. As I walked along this bank edge, the site in question is in orange here, and the picture shows it's directed east where the lake would be behind me. You can see a flag placed just to the right of this bigger tree, and that was the separation of those biological indicators where lakeward or behind me from that flag, you could see sedges, wetland species, you can see the sphagnum moss growing through there, and then behind that flag is the longer standing, more established tree line. Same concept here with this image. The lake is behind me and the upland is behind these flags that I identified with these green arrows, looking at the same biological indicators at this location. All right. So, Sue, if you want to take this one over.
Sure. Nice job, Nicole. Those were great examples. Just wanted to put a map out here for shoreline zoning team coverage. We lost Dale Resbeck due to retirement recently, so things have shifted. The blue area indicates the counties that I have coverage for. The orange is Kathy Kramitz, and then the green is Kristen Rankin. So our contact information is there for you. Nicole's information is, of course, on the top of the slide on the left-hand side. And then, you know, when it comes to, obviously, you guys work with the public all the time, and sometimes you'll be referring folks to the Department of Natural Resources for questions they have, or letting them know that they may need a DNR permit. What we would like you to do, if you have folks that you need to direct to the DNR, we have a frequently asked questions webpage there below my name, and we'd like you to direct folks there. They can get answers to most of their questions, and they have topics listed like riprap, piers, things like that. And then if they are unable to find the answers to their questions, on the upper right-hand page of that website, there is a location where they can submit a question and or a complaint. And then Nicole also has the link down below if you want to direct them to that form for submitting their questions and complaints.
Yeah, so in general, the WMSs, we do get a lot of calls and inquiries. Right now, our contact information isn't showing up on our point of contact viewer. What we're trying to do is funnel as many questions as we can to this online question submittal process, because that goes to intake, where intake can help funnel some of those and answer some of those questions. If you do, however, have a project that you're going to be working on that may need permits, that's where you guys can send us that technical assistance request, and we can work with you guys directly in providing that technical assistance. All right, I guess we can open it up to questions. We can see what, if anyone put any questions in the chat.
Yep, there's no questions in the chat that I see.
Okay.
Anyone?
So do you want to end the recording and then, or do we want to keep questions in the training?
I think we can keep the questions in the training if someone has some questions, and if not, we can see everyone next week. We still have about 15 minutes.
I just had one quick question here. So for some of the sites that are in an agricultural setting, and we may have conservation projects that are proposed that may be in an area of contention, whether it's navigable or not, is there something that you need to see from land conservation staff before DNR is able to do a site visit with us? Is there some preliminary stuff we need to do, or are we just able to schedule a site visit with you if we need some info?
I think that is going to come down to, what that conservation project is and if it's going to trigger Chapter 30 or not. So if it is something that may trigger Chapter 30 permitting, that's where we could get involved. Otherwise, if it's something that doesn't and is more related to setbacks, things like that, then that would be something that I think the shoreline zoning staff would be able to assist for those projects.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, Laura brought something up. Just to recap, a navigable stream must have a bed and bank. How would you determine a channel has a bed if this is vegetated over and it consists of soil versus gravel or another material?
So that's where the physical and biological indicators really come into play to establish if there is a bed. You're going to look for those indicators that has there been inundation in this channel, and where is that mineral soil? So if it is a channel that has cattails, there's still going to be signs of inundation over that, some of those wetland species and aquatic species. And you're going to want to try to envision, when water is flowing through here, is there capacity to float a canoe? These sites can be challenging if it is, let's say, a farm field that does have frequent tilling and disturbance. So that's where you may have to look at adjacent, immediately upstream, downstream, maybe further downstream where there isn't that agricultural activity, to give you a sense of, what capacity of flow is going through here within that channel.
Good question. These are all really good questions. And again, the difficult sites, those seepage lakes, vegetative lake bed, those are some of the most challenging sites. And this is where, being able to reach out to your WMS with the, desktop data and the preliminary information that you have from doing the on-site can really help out. And then we can work together, as a partnership if there are these challenging sites. So looks like there's another follow-up question from Laura. How frequently does it need to flow for it to be considered navigable? Yearly? Question mark. Nicole, do you want to take that one?
Yep, that is a great question. So Case law supports on a reoccurring basis. It doesn't specify annually. So that's where in lake systems, let's say for a seepage lake, you can have these water table, I can't think of the term for it. There's water cycles that a seepage lake or a watershed can have. That could be a 3, 5, 7-year water cycle. So that's where it's really important to look at the historical data. What does it look like in the 80s and the 60s and the 30s? That'll give you an idea of, how often, that water reaches that ordinary high water mark. For terms of navigable, intermittent streams typically have capacity to float a canoe in the spring, but it's dry in the fall. So that reoccurring term is broad, and it doesn't have to be annually.
Good points. One thing, as you talked about the seepage lakes, I thought of, had a couple of questions recently. As we talked about, being prepared before you do an on-site is really important. And on the surface water data viewer, you can click on the link and you can look at details with regard to that lake. And if it does show that it is a seepage lake, you know ahead of time that this could be a super challenging site with a lot of fluctuation, as Nicole had said. So that, doing a little bit of prep work before you go out can help you prepare for what you might expect to need to look for. Good questions.
Yeah, and for those types of scenarios, it's sometimes easier to, instead of being so focused on what you're seeing at your feet immediately on the ground, looking for those ordinary high indicators, sometimes it's nice to take a step back and just look at the shoreline, basically that tree horizon. Where are those longer standing trees? And kind of start there and then work your way closer and closer to the open water. Because typically you're going to see that ordinary high closer to that tree line. So you kind of zoom out, take in the entire surroundings of what you got going on, start high and then work your way low.
Yeah, I think about seepage lakes being challenging when the water is high, but they can be equally challenging when the water has been low for a long period, because you start to see that woody vegetation start to grow up. And so, as you said, Nicole, focusing on that mature, larger tree line can be super helpful in those dry years as well. We'll give folks a couple more minutes. Any more questions? Otherwise, I guess we could wrap it up and see you next week.
All right, sounds good. Everyone that attended, thanks for stopping by, and we will see you next week.
Awesome. Have a great day, everyone.